it is important for any data center operators and owners to assume that water scarcity will become a major cooling constraint. So in planning and adaptation, it's important that operators have now or have plans to transition away from water-intensive cooling systems.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at ISS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we're exploring a topic that's become increasingly critical for the digital economy: how climate-driven physical risks, whether it's extreme heat, water stress, and nature-related hazards, are reshaping the resilience of data centers worldwide. As we all know, these facilities power everything from AI to cloud services, yet many are located in regions becoming more vulnerable as climate pressures intensify. One of our favorite guests, Julia Leske, Managing Director and Senior Consultant at ISS Sustainability in Australia, is back with us to unpack the latest insights on these risks and what investors, including super funds, should be paying attention to. Julia, great to have you back with us.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Julia, I came across a report that your team recently published. It's Actionable Insights, the top sustainability themes in 2026, and we are focusing on the resilience of data centers. But to start us off, which climate risks do you think are the biggest threats to data centers right now? And why are those risks increasing so quickly?
The biggest risks that data centers are facing really relate to the cooling of the servers that they're running. So we're looking into heat waves and water stress. And there are also two risks that are very fast in escalating in terms of the more immediate future. Really, where we can see heat waves, we can already feel that. We're just about to be in a heat wave again. They're increasing in their frequency and intensity, and extreme temperatures can quickly overwhelm the cooling systems. And there is an example that we have in the report which relates to a 2022 heat wave in London, not necessarily a place you think about heat waves straight out of the top of your head. Data centers were overheated, and those outages caused outages in two of the major hospitals there. And then in parallel, we're also seeing water stresses rising. And that is a challenge for data centers because they mainly rely on water-based cooling, making them highly vulnerable when water availability declines. So while these risks might be moderate in the medium-term future, we can see that they will escalate rapidly beyond 2050.
Now, I know that in this report, you looked at 100 data centers across 25 countries, and you looked at a high emission scenario. So what did you find out about these different regions and how they will be affected over the next few decades? I mean, at the very least, how will the world look like in 2030?
Yeah, so what we did, we picked 100 data centers across those 25 countries, and we can see that there's a major divergence in risk exposure over time. And that can even be in centers in similar regions. So it's really location specific in relation to which hazards are playing out in which ways. And that's where it becomes quite important to look into the different outlook over the medium and the long term. We have used a high emission scenario very specifically because we wanted to find out where the potential vulnerabilities are. So a high emission scenario assumes high economic growth, but ongoing fossil fuel use, which will likely lead to a global warming scenario of 4.2 or 4.3 degrees. And what we find is that currently, so in the immediate future around 2030, the risk levels are comparatively low. We only have about 2 data centers came out of the analysis as facing high water stress and 5 as facing high heat wave risks. If we look into 2050, we have almost 20% of the centers in high water stress and over 20% in relation to heat wave risk spikes. And then if we extrapolate that further out into 2050, 2080, we can see that in relation to water stress, over 40% of the centres are in regions that face high water stress. So we can see then, if we look into it, if we look at those two risks side by side, the compound heat and water risks really rise sharply. And there's quite a number of centres that move into a scenario where they have high or high medium risk categories related to water and heat stress.
I'm a big fan of reading sci-fi and fantasy novels, and when we think dystopian future, it almost doesn't feel like it's just in fiction, that this could potentially be the reality. And I think more people should really talk about this research that you have, because that's quite crazy, like 20% in high water stress. Because at the moment, even with the people that I have interviewed around nature, this is probably the first time we're really talking about water stress in that way. Now, one finding that really stood out, you've mentioned this earlier, is the need for more cooling technology. Is that how you say it? Can you describe that? Like, given that so many data centers rely on water for cooling, what does this rising water stress mean for them?
Yes, so with the high risk water stress increasing, it is important for any data center operators and owners to assume that water scarcity will become a major cooling constraint. So, in planning and adaptation, it's important that operators have now or have plans to transition away from water intensive cooling systems. So, that is largely evaporative cooling. And they need to invest in technologies like liquid immersion cooling or closed loop systems or high efficiency air cooling. But then also think about the different sources of water that are available. So fresh water versus recycled water and so on. So there's different areas that operators need to look into. For new data centers, it's really important that site selection incorporates those long-term water availability projections. So not just the current conditions, but then especially using high emissions pathways to identify local water stresses and how much they might increase over time is quite important. Through that and through these different areas, they can then develop water resilience strategies in relation to their cooling management systems.
So now we're thinking heat waves, water shortages, and finding better cooling management systems. How do you think the combined risks change the way companies and investors should think about resilience planning?
Organizations must shift from can we manage heat or can we manage water stress into can we maintain operations when both of these occur together. So, really thinking it through the infrastructure redundancy and scenario stress tested continuity plans.
Now, in that report, talking about the continuity plans, you looked at 320 companies with data center operations and found that only 22% are leaders in business continuity planning. So, what are the biggest gaps companies still have in preparing for climate disruptions? And why do you think so many firms lag in this area? I mean, there have been all these reports from the big tech companies that have really overspent on AI, so we know there'd be more spending on data centers, etc. But why are there these 78% that are lagging in this area?
Yes, it's a good question. So when we look at business continuity management systems, we look at areas such as training and testing, corrective action, and most importantly, coverage of all operations. So not just selective operations where there might be an indication of current risks, but really look into it from an entire organizational perspective. There are a lot of companies that have partial systems, but what our analysis showed is that components like scenario testing or that full organizational deployment is really lacking. And then there's a fairly large proportion of companies that have little or no disclosure as to what your saying there is it indicates that there's low preparedness and poor risk awareness. I suspect, it's really hard to say with authority, but I suspect that especially that long-term climate risk escalation is currently being underestimated by companies. It's very much that continuity planning is generally perceived as costly and non-urgent until there is a disruption that occurs, or you can point towards something that is happening. And then there might be also a lack of regulatory or investor pressure or support, not just pressure, but support for that spending to implement those frameworks and be more systematic about it. And then it could also be that often that the continuity planning and systems sits within the risk function, whereas the sustainability teams who have that really long-term view of the risks might not be very well integrated or working in together, more working in siloed areas. So that could be one of the reasons that it's often underestimated organizationally.
I sincerely hope that this will be addressed on a global level, because if we're talking about water scarcity, I mean, it's a major crisis and we don't want it to get there. Julia, you've been so insightful. Thank you so much for sharing with us one of the key issues raised in this report, which we will share in our show notes if anyone would like to have a copy of it. But finally, anything else that you would like to share with our listeners on this topic?
I think it's important for investors to have the tools and the foresight to see what the immediate, medium, and long-term risks are. And then also, I think the main message is data centers don't just have a high environmental impact themselves, but they also have a high vulnerability in relation to climate hazards and nature dependencies, and to really integrate that thinking together. The other thing that I'd like your listeners to take home with is that we have good tools to have risk assessments, but there's also a wealth of data available in relation to understanding organizational preparedness in relation to those risks and challenges that they have. So there's a lot of information out there, and combining those two sets of data is a very powerful way for your analytics and assessments.
We can no longer use the excuse that we don't know and that we can't measure the impact. As you've said, there are tools and the wealth of data available on this. Julia, once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.